This started in early March of 2022 when I moved into a ground floor apartment in a converted Victorian house in upstate New York. I was 29, recently divorced, and looking for a fresh start somewhere quiet. The apartment was perfect for my needs: affordable, clean, and tucked away on a tree-lined street where nothing ever seemed to happen. The building had been split into 4 units. Mine was in the back corner, with a private entrance and a small patio that faced the alley behind the house. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, lived in the front unit and kept the place well maintained. The other tenants were a grad student who worked nights and an elderly man who kept to himself. For the first few weeks, everything felt normal. I settled into a routine of working from home during the day and taking evening walks around the neighborhood. The area was mostly families and retirees, the kind of place where people waved from their porches and kept their yards neat. But sometime in late March, I started noticing the woman across the alley. She lived in the back apartment of the house directly behind mine, maybe 50 feet away. I could see her kitchen window from my patio, and she could probably see mine just as easily. At first, I thought nothing of it. People look out their windows, it happens. But then I realized she was always there. Every morning when I stepped outside with my coffee, she stood at her window watching me. Every evening when I came home from grocery runs or errands, there she was again. She never waved or acknowledged me directly, just stood there with her hands pressed against the glass, perfectly still. She looked to be in her 60s, with shoulder-length gray hair and a thin frame. She wore the same faded blue robe every time I saw her, day or night. There was something off about her posture, the way she held herself so rigid, like she was concentrating very hard on something. I mentioned it to my sister during one of our weekly phone calls. She laughed and said, maybe the woman was lonely or bored. I tried to convince myself that was all it was, but the feeling in my stomach said otherwise. The watching continued for 2 weeks. Then, it got worse. I started finding things on my patio that didn't belong there. Small items at first: a plastic spoon, a hair tie, a crumpled receipt. Things that could have blown in from anywhere. But they appeared overnight, always placed neatly on the small table next to my door. One morning in mid-April, I found a photograph. It was an old Polaroid, faded and slightly yellowed around the edges. The image showed the back of my building from across the alley, taken from what had to be the woman's apartment. My patio was clearly visible in the frame, including the table where the photo now sat. I called the police. The officer who responded was polite but not particularly concerned. He took notes while I explained about the watching and the items appearing on my patio. When I showed him the photograph, he examined it briefly and handed it back. Could be kids playing pranks, he said. Or maybe someone dropped it and the wind carried it over. Hard to say without more evidence. I asked what would constitute more evidence. He said unless someone was threatening me directly or trying to break in, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested I talk to my landlord about installing better lighting. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I got up to get a glass of water and glanced out my kitchen window toward the alley. The woman was there, standing at her window in the dark. No lights on in her apartment, just her silhouette against the glass. We looked at each other for what felt like 10 minutes. Neither of us moved. Finally, I stepped away from the window and closed the blinds. The next morning brought a new photograph on my patio table. This one showed me standing at my kitchen window the night before, perfectly framed in the shot. I was clearly visible through the glass, holding my water glass, looking directly at the camera. I called the police again. This time, they sent a different officer, a woman who seemed more interested in what I had to say. She looked at both photographs and walked around the patio, noting the sight lines between buildings. "Have you tried talking to her directly?" the officer asked. I said no, that the whole situation made me uncomfortable. She nodded and said she understood, but suggested I consider it. Sometimes people just needed human contact, she said. Maybe a friendly conversation would solve the problem. I didn't want to have a friendly conversation. I wanted the woman to stop watching me and stop leaving things on my patio. But I also didn't want to seem unreasonable. 2 days later, I walked across the alley and knocked on her door. No one answered, even though I could see movement behind the curtains in her front window. I knocked again, louder this time, and called out that I just wanted to talk. The movement stopped, but the door never opened. I left a note explaining that I was her neighbor from across the alley and asking if we could speak about the photographs. I slipped it under her door and went home. That night, I found my note on my patio table. Someone had written a response on the back in small, careful handwriting. I see you every day. You look lonely. I can help. I didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, I sat by my front window, watching the alley and the woman's building. Around 3 a.m., I saw her front door open. She stepped outside, wearing the same blue robe, looked directly at my window, and walked toward my building. I called 911. She was gone by the time the police arrived, but they found fresh footprints in the soft dirt around my patio. The officer who responded was the same woman from before. She took photographs of the footprints and said she would file a report about harassment. Can you arrest her? I asked. Not yet, she said, but we're building a case. Keep documenting everything and call us immediately if she tries to make contact again. The next week was quiet. No photographs, no items on my patio, no figure at the window across the alley. I started to think maybe the police visit had scared her off. Then I found the key. It was sitting on my patio table on a Tuesday morning, a single brass key on a plain metal ring. It looked like it might fit an older door lock, the kind my apartment building had. I picked it up and examined it, then tried it in my own lock. It turned easily. She had somehow gotten a copy of my apartment key. I called the police immediately, then called my landlord. Mrs. Chen was horrified and said she would change the locks that day. She also mentioned that she had seen someone walking around the building late at night earlier in the week, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. The locks were changed by evening. I felt somewhat better, but I also bought a door alarm and a small security camera for my patio. If she came back, I wanted evidence. She came back 3 nights later. The camera caught her approaching my door at 2:47 a.m. She tried the key first, turning it several times when it wouldn't work. Then she stood there for nearly an hour, just staring at my door. Occasionally, she would press her face against the glass or place her palms flat against the surface. The footage was clear enough to see her face for the first time. She looked older than I had thought, with deep lines around her eyes and a hollow expression. But what struck me most was how normal she appeared, like someone you might see at the grocery store or sitting in a doctor's waiting room. The police took the footage seriously. They identified her as Margaret Holt, 68, who lived alone and had no prior criminal record. An officer went to speak with her, but she didn't answer her door. They left a notice explaining that further contact with me would result in charges. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. I started to feel like maybe it was over. Then I got home from work one evening and found my patio door standing wide open. Nothing was missing from my apartment, but I could tell someone had been inside. Small things were out of place. A book moved from one table to another, kitchen chairs repositioned, my bedroom pillow fluffed differently. She had been careful not to disturb anything, obviously, but I knew my own space well enough to notice the changes. I called the police and stayed in my car until they arrived. They searched the apartment and found no signs of forced entry, which made sense since she'd had time to make a copy of the original key. This time, they had enough evidence for a warrant. When they went to arrest her the next morning, they found her apartment empty. According to her landlord, she had moved out in the middle of the night, leaving most of her belongings behind. Among the things she left were dozens of photographs of me, taken over several weeks from various angles around my apartment and the neighborhood. Some showed me walking to my car, others captured me through my windows at different times of day. A few were taken from inside my apartment itself, apparently during her midnight visit. The police issued a warrant for her arrest, but Margaret Holt had disappeared completely. No forwarding address, no credit card activity, no trace of where she might have gone. I moved out the following month. I couldn't stay in that apartment knowing she had been inside, knowing she might come back. Mrs. Chen was understanding and didn't charge me a penalty for breaking the lease early. 6 months later, I got an email from the woman who moved into my old apartment. She had gotten my contact information from Mrs. Chen because she wanted to ask me something. "Did you ever have problems with someone watching your apartment?" she wrote. "There's a woman who stands in the alley at night, and yesterday I found a photograph of my patio door on my table outside." The police said the previous tenant had similar issues, but never told me who. I found some more pictures hidden in the basement storage area. Do you know anything about this? I never replied to her email. I didn't want to know what happened next. I work for a bank maintenance company. We handle properties that have been repossessed or abandoned. Mostly it involves changing locks, draining pipes, and making sure squatters have not moved in. The pay is decent, and I like working alone most of the time. You see a lot of sad stories in this job. Families who lost everything, elderly people who could not keep up with payments, young couples who got in over their heads. You learn not to think about it too much. You just do the work and move on. In the fall of 2021, I got assigned to a 2-story colonial house in a suburb outside Portland. The neighborhood had seen better days. Half the houses had overgrown lawns, and several had for sale signs that looked like they had been there for years. According to my paperwork, the house belonged to a man named Robert Sprouse, who had passed away 6 months earlier. His adult children lived out of state and had decided to let the bank take the property rather than deal with the estate. The house had been empty since his death. I arrived on a Thursday morning around 10. The house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, with tall pine trees blocking most of the view from neighboring properties. The exterior looked fine. White siding, black shutters, a small front porch with 2 wooden chairs still sitting there, as if someone might return any moment. The key was in a lockbox by the front door. I let myself in and immediately noticed the smell. It was not decay or anything terrible, just the stale air of a place that had been closed up too long. The living room was neat and tidy. A recliner faced a large television, and bookshelves lined one wall. Family photos covered the mantel above the fireplace. I started my usual routine. Take photos of each room, check for damage, test the plumbing and electrical systems. The kitchen was spotless, as if someone had cleaned it thoroughly before leaving. In the refrigerator, I found a single item, a note taped to the inside door that read, "Call Margaret about the garden club meeting." The upstairs had 3 bedrooms. The master bedroom contained a bed, a dresser, and a small desk by the window. On the desk sat an old landline phone, the kind with a clear plastic body that showed the internal circuits. Next to it was an address book with worn pages. I was photographing the 2nd bedroom when I heard the phone ring downstairs. I had already checked, and the landline service had been disconnected months ago, but the ringing continued, sharp and insistent. I walked back to the master bedroom. The clear phone on the desk was silent. The ringing was coming from somewhere else in the house. I followed the sound downstairs to the kitchen. On the counter next to the refrigerator was another phone, an older model with a rotary dial. The ringing stopped just as I reached it. I picked up the receiver and listened. There was no dial tone. I checked the phone cord and found it was not even plugged into the wall jack. I set the receiver back down and made a note to mention the phone issue in my report. 20 minutes later, while I was checking the basement, the phone rang again. This time, it was the clear phone upstairs. I climbed the stairs and stood in the bedroom doorway, watching the phone ring. After 10 rings, it stopped. I decided to pick up the receiver. There was no sound at all, not even static. But as I started to hang up, I heard a voice. It was quiet and sounded far away, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. "The garden club meeting is canceled," the voice said. Then, the line went dead. I stood there holding the receiver, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. The voice had sounded like an elderly man, polite but tired. I hung up the phone and looked around the room. Everything was exactly as I had found it. I finished my inspection quickly after that. The house was in good condition overall. No signs of break-ins, no water damage, no major repairs needed. But I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone. Several times I found myself looking over my shoulder or listening for footsteps. As I was packing up my equipment, the kitchen phone rang one more time. I let it ring. After a few minutes, it stopped. I locked the front door behind me and walked to my truck. As I was loading my gear, I noticed movement in the upstairs window. Just a shadow that passed quickly across the glass. Probably just tree branches moving in the wind. I submitted my report that afternoon. Standard property, ready for sale, no issues. I did not mention the phones. What would I have said? That disconnected phones were ringing, and a voice was talking about garden club meetings? They would think I was losing my mind. 3 days later, my supervisor called me into his office. He said the real estate agent had gone to show the house to potential buyers and found all the phones in the house off the hook, every single one. The agent thought maybe vandals had gotten inside, but there were no signs of forced entry. "Did you notice anything unusual when you were there?" my supervisor asked. I told him no. Just an old man's house, neat and clean, ready for new owners. But I kept thinking about that voice and the note in the refrigerator. Call Margaret about the garden club meeting. I found myself wondering who Margaret was and whether she was still waiting for that call. A week later, I was assigned to another property across town. As I was driving there, I passed a small church with a sign out front listing community activities. At the bottom, in small letters, it said, Garden Club, Tuesdays at 2 p.m., contact Margaret Wilson. I pulled over and stared at that sign for a long time. Then I drove on to my next job. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some phone calls are meant to go unanswered. And some people, even after they are gone, still have things they need to say. This happened in 2020. I was 32 then, freshly divorced, and looking for a place to start over. The farmhouse sat on 5 acres outside of town, far enough from everything to give me the quiet I needed. It was old, probably built in the 1940s, with white clapboard siding that needed paint and a wraparound porch that sagged a little on one side. The rent was cheap, and the landlord seemed eager to find someone willing to take care of the place. He mentioned it had been empty for almost 2 years. When I asked why, he just shrugged and said the previous tenant had moved out suddenly for family reasons. The house had character. The wooden floors creaked when you walked across them, and the windows stuck when you tried to open them. There was no central air, just old radiators and a few window units the landlord had installed. But it felt solid, and after months of couch surfing, I was grateful for my own space again. The root cellar was in the backyard, about 20 feet from the kitchen door. It was one of those old-fashioned storm cellars, built into a small hill with concrete walls and a heavy wooden door that opened outward. The door was painted green once, but most of the paint had peeled away, leaving bare wood that had turned gray with age. The landlord showed it to me during the walkthrough. We went down the concrete steps, and he pulled a chain to turn on the single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The space was maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with shelves built into the walls and a dirt floor. It smelled like earth and dampness. Not unpleasant exactly, but close and heavy. He told me the previous tenants had used it for storage, and I could do the same if I wanted. I thanked him, but figured I probably would not need it. I had enough room in the house, and something about the cellar made me uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way the light barely reached the corners, or how the air felt thick and still down there. I moved in during March, and for the first month, everything was fine. I was working from home as a freelance graphic designer, so I spent most of my time inside getting the place organized and settling into a routine. The cellar door stayed closed, and I tried not to think about it. That changed in early April. I was working late one night, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, when I heard a sound outside. It was like someone dragging something heavy across the ground. The sound came from the direction of the root cellar. I looked out the kitchen window, but it was too dark to see much. The yard was empty as far as I could tell. I figured it might be an animal, maybe a raccoon or something larger looking for food. I made a mental note to check the trash cans in the morning and went back to work. The next morning, I walked out to the cellar. The door was still closed, but something was different. The ground in front of the door was disturbed, like someone had been digging or scratching at the earth. The marks were too big to be from a small animal. I opened the cellar door and went down to look around. Everything appeared normal. The shelves were empty except for a few old canning jars left by the previous tenant. The dirt floor looked undisturbed. I closed the door and went back inside, but the scratched earth outside bothered me for the rest of the day. 2 nights later, I heard the sound again. This time, I was ready. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside as soon as I heard the dragging noise. I walked quietly toward the cellar, trying not to make any sound on the gravel path. When I got close enough to see the door clearly, I stopped. The door was open maybe 6 inches, and there was a faint light coming from inside. Not the harsh light from the bulb, but something softer, almost like candlelight. I called out, asking if anyone was there. The light went out immediately. I walked closer and pushed the door open wider, shining my flashlight down the steps. The cellar was dark and empty, just like before. I went down the steps and pulled the chain to turn on the bulb. It worked fine. I looked around carefully, checking every corner and behind the shelves. Nothing seemed disturbed, and there was no sign that anyone had been there. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something I had missed before. There were footprints in the dirt floor. Not fresh ones, but old impressions that were hard to see unless the light hit them just right. The prints were small, like they belonged to a child or a very small adult. I took pictures with my phone and went back to the house. I called the landlord and told him what I had found. He seemed surprised and said he would come by the next day to take a look. When he arrived, we went to the cellar together. The footprints were still there, but they looked different in the daylight, fainter, like they were fading. The landlord studied them for a while, then said they could have been there for years. Old root cellars sometimes preserved things in strange ways, he explained. He asked if I wanted him to install a lock on the door. I said yes. For about a week after that, everything was quiet. The new lock seemed to help, and I started to relax. I even began using the yard more, setting up a small garden and eating lunch outside when the weather was nice. Then one morning I woke up and found the cellar door standing wide open. The lock was still in place, but it was unlocked, hanging loose on the latch. I was certain I had not opened it. I rarely went near the cellar anymore, and I definitely had not been out there the night before. I walked down the steps to check inside, and everything looked normal except for one thing. There was a new set of footprints in the dirt. These were fresh, and they led from the steps to the back corner of the cellar, where they stopped at the wall. I called the police. I told them someone had been on my property and might be hiding somewhere nearby. 2 officers came out and searched the cellar and the surrounding area. They found the footprints, but they could not determine how old they were or who might have made them. One of the officers suggested I install a security camera pointed at the cellar door. He said it was probably just curious kids from town, but it would be good to have evidence if it happened again. I bought a battery-powered trail camera the next day and mounted it on a fence post with a clear view of the cellar. I also bought a heavy-duty padlock and chain to secure the door. The camera recorded for 3 nights without capturing anything unusual. I was starting to think the problem was solved when I checked the footage on the 4th morning. The video showed the cellar door opening at 2:17 a.m., but there was no one visible in the frame. The door simply swung open on its own, slowly and deliberately. A few seconds later, a faint light appeared in the doorway, the same soft glow I had seen before. The light stayed there for almost an hour, barely visible in the camera's night vision. Then it faded, and the door closed by itself. I watched the footage several times, but I could not see anything that might explain what was happening. There were no shadows, no movement, nothing that looked like a person or animal. I saved the video and called the police again. This time, they were less helpful. The officer who came out looked at the footage, but said there was not much they could do. He suggested I contact the landlord about the door. Maybe there was something wrong with the hinges or the frame that made it swing open. I knew that was not the explanation, but I called the landlord anyway. He came out that afternoon and examined the door carefully. The hinges were solid, and the frame was straight. There was no reason the door should open on its own. He asked to see the video, and I showed it to him on my phone. He watched it twice without saying anything, then asked if I had ever researched the history of the property. I told him I had not, and he said he would look into it. He seemed uncomfortable, like there was something he was not telling me. That night, I moved my bedroom to the front of the house, as far from the root cellar as possible. I also started keeping all the curtains closed after dark. The landlord called me the next morning. He had talked to the previous tenant, the one who had moved out suddenly 2 years earlier. The tenant had experienced similar problems with the cellar door opening by itself, along with other strange occurrences. He asked if I wanted to break the lease early without penalty. The offer surprised me, but I told him I needed time to think about it. That evening, I decided to do some research on my own. I went to the county clerk's office and looked up the property records. The house had been built in 1948 by a family named Morrison. They had lived there for almost 30 years before selling it in the late 1970s. After that, the property had changed hands frequently. Most owners only stayed for a year or two. I found one newspaper article from 1952 about a child who had gone missing from the Morrison farm. The child, a 7-year-old girl named Sarah, had disappeared one evening while playing in the yard. She was never found. I made copies of everything I could find and went home to read through it all carefully. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that I needed to leave. But first, I wanted to try one more thing. I had an idea that might help me understand what was happening in the cellar. That night, I set up my laptop near the kitchen window where I could see the cellar door clearly. I also positioned a second camera inside the cellar, pointing toward the corner where the footprints always appeared. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the door opened again. This time, I was watching through the window. The soft light appeared in the doorway, just like in the previous video. But from my angle, I could see something the camera had missed. There was a shape in the light. Small and indistinct, but definitely there. It looked like a child standing in the doorway. The inside camera captured something even more disturbing. As the light grew brighter, I could see the footprints appearing in the dirt floor, one after another, as if someone invisible was walking across the cellar. The prints led to the back wall, where they stopped. Then, faintly, I heard a sound that made me step away from the window. It was a voice, high and thin, calling for help. I did not go outside. I did not investigate further. I packed a bag, loaded my car, and drove to a motel in town. The next morning, I called the landlord and told him I was accepting his offer to break the lease. I never went back to the house, except to arrange for a moving company to collect my belongings. I never learned what happened to Sarah Morrison or why she seemed to be trapped in that root cellar. I did not want to know. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed in my new apartment, I think about that small voice calling for help. I wonder if I should have tried to do something, if there was a way to help her find peace. But mostly, I try not to think about it at all. Some mysteries are better left unsolved.